Finally, it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Anthony Mandal as today's speaker. Anthony and I once worked together in the English Department at Cardiff University, where 20 years ago, exactly, we were both involved in the foundation of the Centre for, I've forgotten what the name of it is, the Centre of Editorial and Intertextual Research. The acronym for that is CEIR, which is still thriving under his own directorship. His thesis on Jane Austen was published as a book titled Jane Austen and the Popular Novel, The Determined Author. There's a double-entendre there with determined, which came out in 2007. This being one of the first studies to view Austen's novels in the context of the 1810s when they were published, rather than in the 1790s when some of them were first conceived. As such, it invited more direct comparison with Scott, whose earlier output of fiction ran in tandem with Austen's own. Since then, Anthony has become a general editor of the new Edinburgh edition of the works of Robert Louis Stevenson, and has also published in 2014 an edition of Mary Brunton's Self-Control, 1811, arguably the first novel published from Scotland to gain recognition on a national British level, and hence a forerunner of Scott's success. His present work includes a co-authored Palgrave history of Gothic publishing, and he's currently on sabbatical leave to write a book on narrative and immersive play. Comparison between Scott and Austen as novelists is not only relevant today, but also timely in view of the recent bicentenary of Austen's death, which among other things has led to her image appearing on an English banknote, matching Scott's much longer tenure on Scottish ones. Anthony's aim today is to use the bicentennial commemoration of Austen's death to explore the relationship between gender and genre in both writers' works, starting with Scott's famous review of Emma, while also addressing some of both authors' changing fortunes over the last 2 centuries. It's a great pleasure, Anthony Mandal.
Okay, thanks very much. I'd like to thank the Edinburgh Walter Scott Club and the Department of English Literature at the University of Edinburgh for hosting tonight's event, for the kind invitation for me to talk. I'd also like to thank Lee for liaising with me in setting things up, and finally Peter. What Peter didn't mention is our history does go back 20 years ago, and that thesis that he spoke about was under his supervision at Cardiff. So it's really, really pleasant and pleasurable for me to be here in Edinburgh talking about this and revisiting work that perhaps I sort of began under Peter's tutelage, 20 years ago, 20-something years ago. I just want to add, I'm not a Scott expert. I have read some Scott and I've worked on Scott, but my primary area of work is Jane Austen. So I'm coming to the subject from that position. Okay, so Peter mentioned bicentenaries as a kind of particular moment. We're undergoing a kind of the stream of bicentenaries, starting in 2011 with the bicentenary of the publication of Sense and Sensibility. There have been a number of bicentennial celebrations of Austen's work and her life, and it culminates in a sense with 1817 and her death, and this being 200 years since. But I think these commemorations will continue until next year. There's one more year left, I think, for Austen, because Persuasion and Northanger Abbey were published in December 1817, but with the title page saying 1818, so I think people are going to eke out a few more celebrations next year. It also leads to other celebrations, so there'll be the bicentenary of Frankenstein next year as well, so another female writer who negotiates a complex relationship between history, fiction, kind of an intellectual movement, but also an engagement with what becomes then very popular writing as well. So I've got here an image of the £10 note, and I think it reflects two things that were dear to Austen, fame and money. She didn't necessarily achieve either in her lifetime through her fiction, but certainly the history, as Peter mentioned, of her subsequent reception has guaranteed her a form of immortality over the last 100 years or so. I think, in a sense, that commemoration then of the bicentenary is an important signal about the role of women writers in the development and the history of the novel, the significant contribution that a writer like Austen makes to our understanding of fiction and the kind of the art of literature as well. I think there are other things that are going on at the moment that maybe link to the subjects and the themes with which Austen and Scott engage in their fiction. One phrase or term that we've encountered, I'm sure, anytime we've got the news on at the moment is fake news. That's something that seems to ring quite regularly. So what is the relationship between fact and fiction in shaping our ideas about nationhood, about identity, about our political destinies? This is something that is explored by both writers in various ways. And I think it has a kind of a resonance now in terms of the debates that are ongoing politically. And also, we're undergoing Brexit as well, which is another controversial, thorny issue that asked us to think about national destiny and national identity in various ways. And again, I think a lot of the debates that are going on now can be traced back to the Regency period and just before and just after with regard to what Austen and Scott were discussing about national identity. The fortunes of Austen and Scott in popular culture sit in an interesting relationship with each other. Scott was, as we know, the most popular novelist of the 19th century, while, as I've suggested already, Austen enjoyed rather limited recognition, something she griped about a number of times. Contrastingly, since the late 20th century, Austen's popularity has reached stratospheric levels, in one regard commemorated by this banknote, as well as the popular Austen mania that has infiltrated all forms of media, whether it's books and rewritings, whether it's film and television adaptations, and other forms of reception. While commensurately, Scott's fame has declined in the popular consciousness. Despite this inversion, as Anne Rigney has noted, even if the figure of Scott himself is no longer very visible in contemporary culture, his long-term legacy continues to be felt not just in the historical epics of Hollywood, but also, and more profoundly, in the widely expressed belief that representing the past is a condition for transcending it on behalf of a new future. In this context, I want to look at how the authors then engage with concepts of history in a number of their works. Austen's novels occupy quintessentially English environment and modern-day manners, narrated from a clearly feminine perspective that celebrates the gentry world while acknowledging its limitations. Her interest lies in the little bit 2 inches wide of ivory on which I work with so fine a brush as produces little effort after much labour, within which 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on. Picking up on this precise focus articulated by Austen herself, a decade later, Mary Russell Mitford observed, "Nothing is quite so delightful as to sit down in a country village in one of Miss Austen's delicious novels, quite sure before we leave it to become intimate with every spot and every person it contains." Just as Austen was midway through her publishing career, Walter Scott made his appearance in the novel market with Waverley in 1814, offering a kind of fiction that was fundamentally dissimilar from that of Austen. In the opening chapter of Waverley, Scott rejects the sentimental, Gothic and fashionable models of fiction in favour of one that is masculine and historiographical. Despite Austen's own similar rejection of melodramatic tropes in her fiction, unlike Scott, she invokes a restricted private world that is essentially feminine. Conversely, Scott himself saw a clear distinction between their approaches, as he recorded in a diary entry for March 1826. He comments, "Also read again, for the 3rd time at least, Miss Austen's very finely written novel of Pride and Prejudice. That young lady had a talent for describing involvements and feelings and characters of ordinary life, which is to me the most wonderful I ever met with. The big bow wow strain I can do myself like any now going, but the exquisite touch which renders ordinary commonplace things and characters interesting from the truth of the description and the sentiment is denied to me. What a pity such a gifted creature died so early." When he embarked upon the project of the Waverley novels, Walter Scott reshaped the discourse of Romantic era fiction as male, historical, and fundamentally public, distancing it from the female, didactic, and essentially private forms that had popularised fiction prior to his inception. Approximating the non-fictional voice of the historical chronicle, Scott's novels reinvest the 18th century romance with what contemporaries labelled accuracy and variety of incident, contextualised within a broader historical framework based on the classics, folk ballads, Shakespeare and other canonical writers. Against these dynamics, Austen's own text refused to engage in such a manifestly male public field, maintaining a fictional enclave which is female, private and internalised. In many ways, the difference between Scott and Austen couldn't be greater. While Austen's novels are provincial, feminine and contemporary, Scott's are national, if not international, masculine and historical. Franco Moretti notes that in Waverley, Charles Stewart never completes his march towards London. He lands in the northwest of Scotland, raises the standard of rebellion in the middle of the Highlands, crosses the Highland line, reaches Edinburgh, crosses the Anglo-Saxon border, reaches Derby, and then he stops. He stops, in other words, exactly where Austen's England begins. Pemberley, the northernmost locality seen in her novels, is also in Derbyshire. And that Scott's world should end exactly where Austen's begins, and Austen's end where Scott's begins. Such a perfect fit, of course, is only a beautiful coincidence. But behind the coincidence lies a solid reality, namely the different forms inhabit different spaces. Significantly, Ina Ferris observes that Waverley reading offered a compelling alternative both to female reading and to feminine writing. In particular, in this period of conservative reaction, evangelical revival, and the domestic didactic novel, Waverley and its successors licensed a nostalgic male-inflected romance of history that offered the satisfaction of emancipation from the necessary restraints of civil society, even as it effectively absorbed male subjectivity into those restraints. Yet as other scholars, some of whom in this room, Peter Garside and Bob Irving, have argued, Scott's own relationship with antecedent contemporaneous women's fiction is far more complicated, and when we bring Austen into that mix, I think it becomes even richer and more sophisticated and nuanced. Despite its largely innovative nature, Waverley nevertheless references contemporary fiction in its paratextual bookend chapters. While the introductory chapter dismisses the popular models, as I said, of sentimental Gothic and fashionable fiction as formulaic and exhausted, the postscript explicitly invokes female forms as sources of inspiration, in particular the national tales of Maria Edgeworth. Indeed, that the Regency period was a singularly significant moment in the history of women's writing is signalled by the experiences of Jane Austen. Ian Duncan notes that the old commonplace of an antithetical relation between romance and reality, invoked by the novel in its own apologies of origin, produces a new dialectical figure of romance as a fulcrum against which reality can be turned around. So in this context, the first part of my talk considers a few textual encounters that took place between Austen and Scott, while the second part then explores in a bit more detail the relationship to history with which their characters and fictions engage. And then finally, my talk will complement these readings by looking at the question of futurity and inheritance. And maybe we can bear in mind futurity and inheritance that both writers have taken on 200 years later, and how those issues cohere with the private and public worlds. Okay. So when Waverley first appeared, Austen wrote to her niece Anna in 1814, Walter Scott has no business to write novels, especially good ones. It is not fair. He has fame and profit enough as a poet, and should not be taking the bread out of other people's mouths. I do not like him, and do not mean to like Waverley if I can help it, but fear I must. Mixing dry wit with raw honesty, Austen recognised that Scott's entry into the novel market would have profound implications for women's writing. Before even reading Waverley, she'd already sensed the threat he presented to writers like herself. A second remark by Austen on Scott, written 2 years later, establishes that she did indeed read the Waverley novels, despite her initial resistance, while simultaneously recording what was not new and not innovative in them as she saw it. Writing to her nephew James Edward, she commented, Uncle Henry writes very superior sermons. You and I must try to get hold of one or two and put them into our novels. It would be fine help to a novel, and we could make our heroine read it aloud on a Sunday evening, just as Isabella Wardour in The Antiquary is made to read the history of the Heartstine and the ruins of St. Ruth, though I believe upon recollection, Lovell is the reader. This echoes Austen's earlier comment on another best-selling novel by another Edinburgh novelist Peter mentioned, Mary Brunton in Self-Control in 1811, which appeared in the same year as Austen's first novel, Sense and Sensibility. She says, I'm looking over Self-Control again, and my opinion of this confirmed of its being an excellently meant, elegantly written work, without anything of nature or probability in it. I declare I do not know whether Laura's passage down the American River is not the most natural, possible, everyday thing she ever does. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Self-Control, but at the dramatic climax of the novel, the heroine Laura, who's been abducted to the wilderness of Canada, manages to escape her kidnapper and then bundles herself into a canoe and floats down the river. And I think Austen here is then poking fun, obviously, at the melodramatic nature of Laura's escape in that novel. So Austen is criticising, in her comments on Brunton and Scott, the popular taste for novels in which exceedingly improbable events take place as a matter of course. In her reference to the Antiquary, Austen jibes at Isabel Wardell's Gothic story, The Fortunes of Martin Waldeck, which is read aloud by her erstwhile suitor Lovell against the backdrop of a decaying convent. By 1815, the inset tale was an old motif, which many recent women novelists had abandoned in favour of direct and interrupted narrative. Whether Scott was intentionally, even ironically, pastiching his romance predecessors or not, Austen considered this device to be an outmoded one, which could be used just as arbitrarily to spice up some sermons as it purportedly did pioneering fiction. In December 1815, John Murray, the publisher of Emma and friend of Scott, approached him about writing a review of Austen's novel for the Quarterly Review. He said, "Have you any fancy to dash off an article on Emma? It wants incident and romance, does it not? None of the author's other novels have been noticed in the Quarterly, and surely Pride and Prejudice merits high commendation." The review appeared anonymously in the Quarterly for October 1815. Actually, it was published in March 1816, so there was a 6-month delay or so. Scott begins by charting the explosion in novel reading as a lead-in to his review, emphasising the inherently intertextual practice novel reading has become. So he says, "Gradually, the reader became familiar with a land of fiction and adventures of which he assimilated not with those of real life, but with each other." The review traces the transformation of the novel from romance to realism, although the realism of the discussion is not quite what Scott wishes it would be. Austen's work belonged to a class of fictions which has arisen almost in our own times, and which draws characters and incidents introduced more immediately from the current of ordinary life than was permitted by the formal rules of the novel. The best the modern novelist can hope to achieve is the precise, but only mildly interesting documentation of contemporary manners. Scott overcomes his partial dissatisfaction with domestic fiction by suggesting that Austen's skill compensates for the lack of variety in incident. Nonetheless, he perceives that her depiction of what he calls the middling classes of society restricts both plot and character. And in an evocative passage, we're told that at Highbury, Cupid walks decorously and with good discretion, bearing his torch under a lantern instead of flourishing it around to set the house on fire. So I think that gives you a kind of sense of what he means here. Despite those reservations, Scott's overall view of Emma is positive, while simultaneously conceding its limitations. The lexicon used to define Austen's style is a restricted, feminized one. We're told the story has a simple plan. The subjects are not often elegant, and certainly never grand. The author's merit consists much in the force of a narrative conducted with much neatness and point, and a quiet yet comic dialogue. In Scott's account, fiction like Austen's replaces the grandeur of romance with a narrative grounded in minutiae, resulting in a precision through which, we're told, the characters of the speakers evolve themselves with dramatic effect. Scott's review contrasts Austen's microcosmic attention to detail with a more general historical realism. This latter is conceptual and panoramic rather than specific and domesticated, the sweeping communal view of a broad landscape rather than the provincial life of the individuals within it. If Austen's fiction resembles, in Scott's words, cornfields and cottages and meadows, it's clear whose style Scott has in mind when he mentions by comparison the highly adorned grounds of a show mansion or the rugged sublimities of a mountain landscape, his own. Nevertheless, as William Galperin has noted, unlike some of Austen's lay readers who recognise the divergence from realistic practice as it had been prescribed and defined at the time, Scott may well have been the first to install Austen as the realist par excellence. Throughout his review, the word history recurs in meaningful ways. For example, we're told that the closest fiction can approximate to history is in the form of romance. Such a history as romance, he says, resembles an ingenious fictitious narrative, exactly in the degree in which an old dramatic chronicle of the life and death of some distinguished character, where all the various agents appear and disappear as in the page of history. Scott's opinions on fiction and history, expressed in the review of Emma, are reified in his Waverley novels. For instance, romantic and tragic figures such as Fergus MacIvor, Edgar Ravenswood, and Hugh Redgauntlet are introduced in order to illustrate the workings of history upon men before they're put into the past of history. Irresponsibly and idealistically during the 1745 Jacobite insurrection, Edward Waverley endangers the delicate social fabric of newly formed Britain. The novel's practice detaches Waverley from his romantic imaginings and the infeasible bygone world that MacIver and the Stuarts represent, bringing him into the real societal world of Hanoverian Britain. Similarly, the earliest kind of novel, the legitimate child of the romance, is described as a history that appeals to readers by taking them outside of their own conceptual worlds, before returning them to it. The romance excites the imagination through its sublimity and grandeur, while the sentimental novel appeals to one's better nature in celebrating the power of virtue. In a similar vein to the old romances, Scott's historical novels transposed the hero, a 19th century reader surrogate, from his familiar world into one permeated with historicity. As a result, Scott's historical fiction doesn't employ the specificity of Austenian realism, offering instead a broad chronicle that juxtaposes events and characters, favouring an essentially public model, which lends itself to a masculine discourse, in opposition to the private boundaries of female experience that typify Austen's novels. And it's to those issues that I want to turn for the next part of my talk. A number of critics have pointed out how the influence of philosophical history on Scott aligns the historical novelist's authenticity less in the slouched adherence to fact than in conveying to the reader a convincing sense that what happens in the fiction is likely to have happened indeed. Of course, this is what George Lucas saw as Scott's crowning achievement, which traces an accommodationist vision of the past that would appeal to the modern reader through its combination of the historical with the dramatic, the personal and the effective, bringing together the aristocratic and bourgeois perspectives into balance. Yet this meliorism is not without its own tensions, as Daniel Cotton pointed out in the Civilized Imagination over 30 years ago, and as Catherine Jones has suggested more recently. So Cotton says the vision of history that Scott explicitly proposes as the controlling vision in his novels is directly challenged in every situation of these novels, and there are many of them, in which their protagonists experience themselves as being helpless before essentially impersonal forces responsible to no order or reason, progress or truth. Scott's narrative itself often seems to incline towards favouring the disordered point of view of the characters rather than the orderly point of view that is otherwise proposed as the author's own. One notes, for example, and here lies a similarity to Austen, that the marriages, reconciliations and inheritances that occur in the conventional endings of most of Scott's novels generally are given succinctly, abruptly and self-consciously, as if begrudged. Jones likewise says that Scott's analysis draws upon the general theoretical principles of Scottish philosophical history, and within that framework highlights the distinctiveness of Scotland's historical path. Yet Scott's relationship to philosophical history is one of disorientation as well as cooperation. Scott's novelisation then of history renders it multifaceted and dialogic, drawing together other marginal discourses into the master narrative of history, while demonstrating the often violent contingency that moulds future outcomes through the sublimation of the past. Likewise, Austen's seemingly cosy domestic narratives often adumbrate hidden histories that typically, but not always, occur off-stage, darkening the well-regulated world of manners of the provincial England that she illustrates. In Northanger Abbey, Catherine Morland discusses the merits of literature and history with her friend Eleanor Tilney. So Catherine says, "I can read poetry and plays and things of that sort, and do not dislike travels, but history, real solemn history, I cannot be interested in. Can you?" Eleanor replies, "Yes, I am fond of history." To which Catherine responds, "I wish I were too. I read it a little as a duty, but it tells me nothing that does not either vex or weary me. The quarrels of popes and kings, with wars or pestilences in every page, the men also good for nothing, and hardly any women at all. It's all very tiresome. Yet I often think it odd that it should be so dull, for a great deal of it must be invention. The speeches that are put into the heroes' mouths, their thoughts and designs, the chief of all this must be invention, and invention is what delights me in other books." So here she sees a tension between the voice of history and the voice of romance, and she would imagine that one would feed into the other, but I think what she's getting at here is it's the exclusion of this Stellan perspective in particular that does frustrate Catherine, that I think then by extension Austen herself sees as a limitation. So this is something that figures in an early Austen novel, although it was published posthumously in 1818, it was nevertheless the third novel that she actually wrote at the end of the 1790s. But in her last published novel, Persuasion, so a novel published 20 years later, Austen returns to this issue when she features a brief but notable debate between Captain Harville and Anne Elliot regarding the fidelity of the sexes. So I've given you the full passage for context, but I'm only going to quote the bits in bold. So when Harville proclaims that all histories are against you, all stories, prose and verse, Anne's response is an explicit rejection of the public sphere and, by extension, I think, the historiographical voice. If you please, no reference to examples in books. Men have had every advantage of us in telling their own story. I will not allow books to prove anything. As Claire Lambert has suggested, Austen's novels describe a modern world in which most of the characters find history tedious to read, irrelevant to their concerns, and limiting to their wishes. But the past cannot be entirely denied, and the novels show several negotiations with it. Indeed, in Northanger Abbey, Catherine Morland constructs her own counter-history of the Tilney family, relocating the modern abbey as a site of Gothic disturbance and comparing its patriarch, General Tilney, as the enforcer of domestic oppression to the villa of Anne Radcliffe's popular Gothic novel, The Mysteries of Udolpho. So when she looks upon him, and again I'm only quoting the bit in bold, it was the air and attitude of Montoni. What could more plainly speak the gloomy workings of a mind not wholly dead to every sense of humanity in its fearful review of past scenes of guilt? Unhappy man. For Austen's heroines, then, the past offers a catalogue of displacements and distortions which work together in limiting their mobility and burdening them with various forms of sanctioned behaviour that depends on notions of tradition and duty. Public history exists in the realm of the masculine, excluding women, who are obliged to employ other forms of writing, most particularly fiction, in order to find self-expression. Indeed, Janine Barkes argues recently that the distinction between Austen and Scott is more nuanced than we might initially think, given the ostensible differences in their writing. She says Austen's own book narrows the perceived gap between history and novel writing, between writers of fact and fiction. Austen writes just as Sir Walter Scott is about to emerge with overwhelmingly successful hybrids of history and fiction. Her labour as a novelist remakes, as does her contemporary Scott, historical fact into realist fiction. I think the difference, of course, is how they go about negotiating that relationship. Notwithstanding their different approaches, Austen and Scott scrutinised the association between individuals and historical awareness. Ignoring the lessons of the past or locking oneself within it, which both writers show to be much the same thing, leads to paralysis and stagnation. In The Bride of Lammermoor, Edgar Ravenswood is suspended between his desire for Lucy Ashton and his filial duty to enact vengeance on Lucy's father, Sir William, resulting in Lucy's descent into madness and Edgar's erasure in the quicksand of Calpe's flow. Similarly, the antiquary's Earl of Glenallan is destroyed emotionally and physically by a Gothic history of possible incest, kidnapping, and suicide. Sir Arthur Wardell isolates himself from the Fairport community in that novel by his obsessive adherence to past glories, despite the fact that he's on the verge of bankruptcy. As Jonathan Oldbuck, the antiquary of the novel's title, tells him, the gratitude of the poor people naturally turns to the civil virtues of your family. You don't hear them talk of Red Hand or Hell in Harness. He's referring here to Sir Arthur's ancestors. As a result, the self-important Sir Arthur is swindled by the German conman Dousterswivel and ends up imprisoned. Austen's own misguided baronet, Sir Walter Elliot in Persuasion, is as obsessed with the glories of the past and blind to the responsibilities of the present. We first see him poring over the baronetage, which serves both as an exercise in self-elevation and an evasion of his responsibilities as a landlord. So we're told, there his faculties were roused into admiration and respect by contemplating the limited remnant of the earliest patents. There any unwelcome sensations arising from domestic affairs changed naturally into pity and contempt. His interest is purely solipsistic, with Kellynch Hall operating as an elevating arena of social decorum turned ritual. And we can compare this to Lady Catherine's Rosings in Pride and Prejudice, for example. The entropy of Sir Walter's habits is literally inscribed by the Elliot entry in the baronetage, which pretentiously notes his inability to produce a direct male heir. We're told, a stillborn son, November the 5th, 1789. This takes on an added resonance in Mrs. Clay's remark about the similarity between the baronet and his heir, Mr. William Walter Elliot, who we're told are exactly like father and son. If Mr. Eliot is not the ideal inheritor in Scottian terms, he certainly is the appropriate heir to Sir Walter. Just as Sir Arthur's obsession with the past leads him to lose his own estate, so Sir Walter would rather revel in the status entailed upon him from the past rather than secure his property in the present, when it becomes clear that their debts will force the Eliots to abandon Kellynch. Both Anne and Lady Russell enjoin upon Sir Walter the necessity of sacrificing some of his luxuries to maintain his estate with due dignity and reverence, but his response is to sacrifice the dignity of the family to continue the luxuries of the day. For Sir Walter, the estate does not represent the social inscription of the prerogatives and obligations of the landed interest, but is an index of his eminence and his privilege. Similarly, for Sir Arthur, the promise of renewed prosperity that arises from the Misticot treasure is not a provision against the errors of the past, but a chance for self-aggrandizement. So we're told, he corresponded with an architect of eminence upon a plan of renovating the castle of his forefathers in a style of extended magnificence that might have rivaled that of Windsor, and laying out the grounds on a suitable scale. Much as the Waverley novels focus neither on the remote past nor the immediate present, but on the liminal relation of both, the since of Waverley's subtitle, Persuasion compares then with now. The novel's discourse is shaped by this perspective, not only in its focus on the stultifying effects of the past upon the present, but also its persistent recourse to the past as a means of explaining that present. The relationship between the two can be seen in the opening sequence, which moves smoothly then from Sir Walter's obsession with the baronetage to a history of his daughter Elizabeth's disappointment in Mr. Eliot 13 years earlier. Throughout Persuasion, the narrative moves between past and present so persistently that they become almost indivisible. Or more precisely, they become such blurred concepts that the narrative is generated from the tension between these two poles, and the world which is created falls between memory and experience. Anne paradigmatically employs her past memories of Captain Wentworth as an index to her current encounters with him in the novel. This culminates in a scene of mutual recognition that occurs near the end of Persuasion, when we're told the lovers returned again into the past, more exquisitely happy, perhaps, in their reunion than when it had been first projected, more tender, more tried, more fixed in the knowledge of each other's character, truth, and attachment, more equal to act, more justified in acting. Here, Anne and Wentworth employ the past to gain a better understanding of the present, unlike Sir Walter and his daughter Elizabeth, whose adherence to the past isolates them in the cold rituals of social decorum. Despite their similar perspectives on history, Scott and Austen depart in one fundamental way, which I've already hinted at. For Scott, the past imbricates with the present in order to substantiate the pre-existing social and historical world, which the hero then steps into. By contrast, the novel like Persuasion proposes a forward-looking view that critiques and subsequently abandons inherited social structures. For Austen, the mistakes of the past inform the present and enable the protagonists to create a new future for themselves, detached from the burdens of past inheritance and an inherited past. The result is a condition of being entirely detached from estates, entails, and titles, a future which is quintessentially personal and romantic. So, in the previous part of my talk, I've spoken about Sir Arthur and Sir Walter's obsession with naming and identity, their fixation with the chimerical past. I want to now think a little bit about how concepts of futurity and legitimacy mesh with these preoccupations. For Scott, the focus of Guy Mannering, for instance, falls upon the dispossessed heir of the Ellangowan estate, Harry Bertram, whose story recounts a double reclamation of both his personal identity and his aristocratic privilege. It passes from its rightful owners, the Bertrams, to a sly usurper, Gilbert Glossop. In The Antiquary, the paradigm of multiple identities is mirrored in the issues surrounding the ownership of the Glenallan properties, which are themselves bifurcated into the old place and the new place. Similarly, in The Bride of Lammermoor, the old laird of Ravenswood is forced to give up ownership of his estate to William Ashton, leaving his son Edgar with the decaying Wolf's Crag and a vendetta. Red Gauntlet's Darcy Latimer begins the novel with no sense of his paternity, leading him to speculate on his identity at the start of the novel. So you'll remember he thinks he's either son of some nabob, or how's he come by his state in the world. Although the Scottish hero is the protagonist of the novel, his role is to receive his inheritance, not to create it. As numerous scholars have argued, the passivity of Scott's heroes both establish them as reader surrogates and allows them to travel the topography of the landscape being described at the author's whim, enabling much of the variety lauded by Scott's contemporaries. The colourful but anarchic world of the past is safely contained within the master narrative of the historical chronicle, consequently serving the present without threatening it. In these terms, Scott's passive heroes are metonyms for contemporary society, establishing their rights within the context of social structures rather than outside of them. Those who cannot fit, like Edgar Ravenswood, are compelled to being quite literally erased from landscape and from memory. The successful Waverley hero, in contrast, ameliorates past and present through his restorative but largely figurative role. If by and large, Scott presents passive heroes whose reinstatement, or otherwise, to their rightful inheritance generates the impetus of the novels, Austen's response subversively dismantles such processes. In Sense and Sensibility, John Dashwood is the legally entailed heir to Norland Park, and in Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Collins will secure Longbourn after Mr. Bennet's death. In both cases, deserving female relatives are ousted or under threat of exile in a system where moral deservingness and legal processes come into conflict with each other. More particularly, as already suggested, in Persuasion, as the legitimately entailed heir of the novel, Mr. Elliott's social right to Kellynch Hall is undisputed. He's first presented to us in absentia as an entry in Sir Walter Elliot's beloved baronetage. So we're told, heir presumptive, William Walter Elliot, Esquire, great-grandson of the second Sir Walter, so his pedigree is fixed on the page. Austen maintains a kind of historicity, almost chiming with Scott's views, by providing a chronicle of the past of the living generations of the Elliots in the first chapter. Unlike Scott's heroes, however, Mr. Elliot disregards Sir Walter, despite being courted by the baronet as a match for Elizabeth, his eldest daughter. We're told, instead of pushing his fortune in the line marked out for the heir of the House of Elliot, he had purchased independence by uniting himself to a rich woman of inferior birth. Mr. Elliot had attempted no apology, and showed himself as unsolicitous of being longer noticed by the family, as Sir Walter considered him unworthy of it. All acquaintance between them had ceased. If the Laird of Ellangowan and the Earl of Glenallan were racked by grief at the loss of their heirs, who later returned seeking restitution, the Barons of Kellynch has for 13 years disdained communication with an heir who himself has deemed it unnecessary to visit the ancestral home. When Mr. Elliot does return to the family circle, he's seemingly a changed man. So we're told that he seems prudent and rational, ungoverned by passions, certainly not a man of extremes. He's steady, observant, moderate, candid, never run away with by spirits or by selfishness, which fancied itself strong feeling. Nevertheless, despite these commendations, Anne senses there is something amiss in his private persona. He certainly knew what was right, she reflects, nor could she fix on any one article of moral duty evidently transgressed. But yet, she would have been afraid to answer for his conduct. She distrusted the past, if not the present. Anne soon discovers that her instincts were correct, and that Mr. Elliot wears merely a mask of social decorum, when her school friend Mr. Smith reveals his duplicity and hypocrisy. A historical perspective emerges here, with the past providing a key to the present, offering the promise of revelation as well as resolution. Mr. Elliot's attitude inverts those of the Waverley heroes. While the latter search for their identities through their names, he wishes to be shed of his, both of his like a skin, commenting in a youthful letter. I don't have that. He says, "I wish I had any name but Elliot. I am sick of it. The name of water I can drop, thank God." Not only is this a snub towards the present owner of Kellynch, as Walter is the ancestral forename of the family, Mr. Elliot wishes to obliterate his entire familial identity, with Mrs. Smith saying, "I've often heard him declare that if baronetcies were saleable, anybody should have his for £50, arms, motto, name and livery included." His feelings echo that of another of Austen's undeserving heirs, Frank Churchill in Emma, who declares himself sick of being in England. Scott's victorious heirs typically redeem the mistakes of their ancestors, serving to unite a cross-section of the community as they do so. Most of Austen's heirs, however, rather than offering restitution, replicate the vanity of their predecessors. Indeed, in Persuasion, it's the interlopers, such as the Crofts, who are shown to be worthier landlords of the estate than either Sir Walter or Mr. Elliot. Whereas the entail works in Bertram's favour and is socially approved, in Persuasion it represents the failure of a decadent gentry, the foolishness of passing their estates to middle-class Aravis killed Godfrey Bertram and the Laird of Ravenswood, but Sir Walter is more than happy to live in exile rather than give up his luxuries. In Red Gauntlet, Darcy learns how to translate the romantic dreams of an unfixed youth into a productive commitment to family modernity. By contrast, figures like Frank Churchill and Mr. Eliot articulate a break with tradition and the vanity of Regency consumptiveness, devoid of any connection to social benefit. As such, their success in maintaining the external equanimity necessary for social decorum demonstrates that their success in maintaining their external equanimity necessary for social decorum demonstrates that, for Austen, the presumed heir of the estate is not necessarily the heir presumptive of the text. Whereas the Scottian plot correlates sociability with decency, underscoring the hero's legitimate and moral rights to inherit, Austen's narratives bifurcate the social moral stands into mutually competing or dichotomous energies. In this context, the past plays a vital role in renegotiating the present for both Austen and Scott. However, the fundamental difference that underpins their historical perspectives lies in the manner in which they prioritise the private and public respectively. In the Waverley novels, the private is portrayed as essentially untrustworthy, a hindrance to social cohesion, and a force which must be ultimately subsumed by the broader workings of historical inevitability. In Guy Mannering, A Secret Veil, Sophia Mannering casts over her daughter's romance with Bertram leads to ambiguity and family tragedy. Again, in The Antiquary, Elspeth admonishes Glenallan that his own clandestine marriage to his cousin, Evelyn Neville, partly aided by the Countess's machinations, can only result in upset. Of course, the secret betrothal between Edgar and Lucy drives the narrative of the Bride of Lammermoor with similarly tragic consequences. For Austen, the opposite obtains. The public world intrudes upon the private life of the individuals, preventing meaningful communication or suppressing the opportunity for individual expression. The congruence of public and private is rare, however, and social rituals typically vitiate the heroine's chances of happiness. For instance, the first important conflict between duty and desire and persuasion occurs in chapter 19, when Anne encounters Wentworth in Bath. But being part of Mr. Eliot's party, she's forced to leave him grudgingly. A more telling second episode occurs shortly afterwards, when Anne's composure is ruffled, when Mr. Eliot rouses Wentworth's jealousy by claiming her attention. Anne could not refuse, but never had she sacrificed to politeness with a more suffering spirit. How was such jealousy to be quieted? How was the truth to reach Wentworth? How, in all the peculiar disadvantages of their respective situations, would he ever learn her real sentiments? It was a misery to think of Mr. Eliot's attentions. Their evil was incalculable. In Persuasion, it is the public sphere that is essentially untrustworthy. Mr. Eliot's entrance into the Eliot's Bath circle establishes how social ritual chokes honest intercourse that merges desire and morality. Contrastingly, the private world of conversation and correspondence offers the most unambiguous indication of people's characters and relationships. In Persuasion, the romantic theme, imagined as a purely private exchange of feelings, dominates, and Anne's earlier relationship with Wentworth is not revealed to the public world, existing as a purely private history. A history that is contained primarily within the two lovers, but also within the Eliot family, and most potently of all, I think, in Anne's mind. In fact, the public belief is that Mr. Eliot will marry either Anne or Elizabeth, and that Wentworth will marry Louisa Musgrove because of the flirtation that Louisa and Wentworth have. Whereas that flirtation between Wentworth and Louisa has been ascribed in the public domain, the rekindled love between him and Anne is a private, almost unvocalised act. Their first conversation in Bath, which reawakens their romance, operates on two levels. The first, a public recapitulation of events that take place in Lyme. That's when Louisa falls while hopscotching at the steps in Lyme Regis on the Cobb, and then her subsequent engagement to Captain Benwick. The second is a sublimated concession of affection by Wentworth towards Anne. So we're told, his choice of subjects, his expressions, and still more, his manner and look had been such as she could see in only one light. Sentences begun which he could not finish, his half-averted eyes, a more than half-expressive glance. He must love her. Similarly, Anne's jousting with Harville about the fidelity of the sexes functions publicly as an amiable contest of wits, but also, and Anne is conscious of this in the theme, it privately informs Wentworth of her own unbroken attachment towards him. The result of this is his letter to her, in which he confesses his continuing love, using a pretext for leaving the letter before Anne, with eyes of glowing entreaty fixed on her for a moment. The direction itself, we're told, is hardly legible, yet on the contents of that letter depend all which this world could do for her. A purely private, even feminized act which ignores the public in favour of the intimate, Wentworth's letter is metonymic for the whole impetus of persuasion. We're told a word, a look will be enough to decide. In the Waverley novels, not only is the romantic plot subordinated to the historical chronicle, the fate of the heroine is also subordinated to the fortunes of the hero. In the closing dialogue of Guy Mannering, Lucy Bertram's inheritance of Singleside from Margaret Bertram is redirected from her hands to those of Bertram, who then elects to pass it back to his sister before it is renamed Mount Hazelwood. In Austen's hands, this story would have been treated as emblematic of women's marginalisation by society. In Scott, it is uncritically accepted as the norm. In The Antiquary, Oldbuck repeatedly refers to Lovell as a phoenix, underscoring how his personal rebirth will reinvigorate decadent social strata, in this case the Wardle and Glenallan lines, with middle-class energy. As proof of this, he leads the military contingent which announces the safety of Fairport precisely at the moment of his recognition by his father. By contrast, while military valour is lauded in Persuasion, especially when contrasted with the calcification of the gentry, it is in the domestic and private worlds that it is finally celebrated. It is revealing that Austen's closing image simultaneously contrasts the public and private role of Navy life, while clearly prioritising the latter. We're told that Anne gloried in being a sailor's wife, but she must pay the tax of quick alarm for belonging to that profession which is, if possible, more distinguished in its domestic virtues than in its national importance. Okay, notwithstanding their differences in the treatment of past and present, of public and private, there's one key area of confluence which I think links the perspectives of both Austen and Scott. And I want to wrap up just by briefly considering this. Darcy Latimer begins Red Gauntlet as an outsider from Edinburgh society. He's an orphan of uncertain parentage, dissatisfied with the commercial world of mid-18th century life. His holiday to the southwest borders of Scotland and Dumfriesshire soon become a quest for self-identity. But as the novel makes clear, identity is a precarious and shifting thing, mirrored in the novel by the dangerous Solway Sands from which Darcy has to be rescued. In many ways, his fate is emblematic of the various Waverley heroes who preceded him, whether their ultimate fates are tragic, as in the case of Edgar Ravenswood, or redemptive, as in the case of Harry Bertram and Lovell. While Austen's heroines may not always be orphans, they are often threatened with a not too dissimilar fate. The Dashwood sisters, Elizabeth Bennet, and Fanny Price all face lives of marginalisation, which reshapes their identities in various ways. A number of them, like Elizabeth, end up travelling, like Darcy, on an adventure away from their home that enables them to reinterpret their relationship to society and to modernity. Perhaps the most relevant example here, though, is Catherine Morland and her sojourn in the all-too-prosaic Tilney estate, Northanger Abbey, which serves to divest her of her romantic yearnings and lead her towards an accommodation with modernity and its consequent rewards, in this case, the hand of Henry Tilney in marriage. Unlike the romantic hero, Scott's prudent heroes, as I've said, function as reader surrogates, operating as a medium for introducing historical and topographical detail while sharing their readers' unfamiliarity with the world being described. Ultimately, Scott's novels are not about heroes and heroism, these are concepts that belong to the past, but rather about the transition from one age to another, moreover, one worldview to another. Waverley's role, for example, is to grow from his youthful romanticism into a socialised adult who is intrinsically committed to modern values and the very modern values that reflect Scott's readers. In similar ways, Austen's heroines must dispatch their own kinds of romanticism, or what the narrator of them terms imaginism, very, very powerfully. And this is an idealised and ultimately narcissistic view of the world that can threaten to overwhelm social decorum and meaningful fulfilment. If Austen's novels are set firmly within the reader's present, providing a recognisably modern world, they must undertake similar moral journeys to those of Scott's protagonists, overcoming the challenges of the past to reach an accommodation with the present, while negotiating between the public and private worlds. Of course, the dialogic nature of both authors' novels suggests that such an accommodation comes at a price, and the two views of what is lost from the past and what is gained in the present are always suspended simultaneously in our view. Critics have pointed to the importance of the crucial scene when Waverley bids farewell to his romantic dreams near the end of the novel. So we're told, he felt himself entitled to say firmly, though perhaps with a sigh, that the romance of his life was ended and that its real history had now commenced. He was soon called upon to justify his pretensions to reason and philosophy. Likewise, in Northanger Abbey, Catherine concludes that charming as were all Mrs. Radcliffe's works, and charming even as were the works of all her imitators, it was not in them, perhaps, that human nature, at least in the Midland counties of England, was to be looked for. Nonetheless, Catherine's Gothic intuitions about General Tilney have been not quite off the mark, and the penultimate chapter of the novel reflects that the pragmatic view might not always be sufficient, leaving room for imaginism after all. We're told, in suspecting General Tilney of either murdering or shutting up his wife, Catherine had scarcely sinned against his character or magnified his cruelty. At the close of Waverley, the sentimentalised portrait of Waverley and Fergus at the heart of the newly restored Televelan echoes Edward's sigh in ekphrastic form, suggesting both an erasure of the doomed Jacobite past and the continuing power of the romantic vision in a world increasingly marked by hard pragmatism. We're told it was a large and animated painting representing Fergus MacIvor and Waverley in their Highland dress. The scene was a wild rocky mountainous pass down which the clan were descending in the background. It was taken from a spirited sketch drawn while they were in Edinburgh by a young man of high genius and had been painted on a full-length scale by an London artist. Raeburn himself, whose Highland chiefs do all but walk out of the canvas, could not have done more justice to the subject, and the ardent, fiery and impetuous character of the unfortunate chief of Glenakea was finely contrasted with the contemplative, fanciful and enthusiastic expression of his happier friend. Beside his painting hung their arms, which Waverley had borne in the unfortunate Civil War. The whole piece was beheld with admiration and deeper feelings. Waverley's personal journey then moves from metaphysical illusion through melancholy disenchantment to reattachment with the modern world, achieved through a perspective that is simultaneously ironic and sentimental, as figured in this scene. The solution is not a celebration of new political structures, but a validation then ultimately perhaps of personal ones, to come into conflict with the ostensible broader narrative of Scott's Waverley novels. And yet it's ironically in a movement that reverses Scott's male appropriation of the female genre. So here in the scene is kind of feminising history in a novel that itself masculinises the genre of fiction. A counterpoint to this moment of sorts occurs in a crucial scene in Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth Bennet's first sight of Pemberley, the home of the misunderstood suitor and the most eligible bachelor of the novel, don't forget, Fitzwilliam Darcy. The episode at once underscores the materialistic, one might say vulgar, pronouncements of the novel's immortal opening line, while at the same time proffering a romantic Cinderella story as a counter-narrative. It offers a description that in many ways takes us back to Scott's topographical account of the history of fiction in his review of Emma. Surveying the estate and reflecting on its function as a moral and social emblem of Darcy's worth, Elizabeth lets out her own sigh of sorts. They gradually ascended for half a mile and then found themselves at the top of a considerable eminence, where the wood ceased and the eye was instantly caught by Pemberley House, situated on the opposite side of the valley, into which the road was similar Brunton wound. It was a large, handsome stone building, standing well on the rising ground and backed by a ridge of high, woody hills, and in front a stream of some natural importance was swelled into greater, but without any artificial appearance. Its banks were neither formal nor falsely adorned. Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen a place which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. They were all of them warm in their admiration, and at that moment she felt to be mistress of Pemberley might be something. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Anthony. There's a very dense account of these two writers, and all the way through I saw them converging and diverging and converging and diverging in most interesting ways. I'm sure some people will want to ask questions about the things you discussed. Any questions?
Thanks, I had a fantastic talk. As you know, I'm very interested in comparing these two writers. I'm just wondering, I mean, Austen writes 3 novels before Scott starts publishing fiction. And I think I'm right in saying the second 3 are written after Waverley, is that right? So Mansfield Park.
Mansfield Park is kind of running alongside.
It's 1814 to
Yeah, so she was published in 1814, but she's writing it sort of around 1812, 1830.
Okay.
So certainly Emma, Persuasion and Sanditon,
Yeah.
which was an unpublished novel draft, they all appear post-Scott.
I was just wondering if you see any sign of Austen in any way changing her practice as a novelist because Scott is there. I mean, you know that lecture where she sees Scott's competition. And I just wonder if there's anything she does differently with this stuff. I think in particular in terms of nationality, because this, you get this great quote where Elizabeth looks at Pemberley, contrast to Fergus and Waverley. What Elizabeth doesn't seem to be seeing there is an image of England, whereas Emma, when I think it's in the strawberry picking scene, she looks at a very similar scene, and she says what she's looking at is English comfort, English culture, English verdure. So she sees that a similar landscape, but in national terms. And I just wondered if that might could be accounted for by the sense that Scott has made sort of nationality.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of interesting points that you adumbrate there. Firstly is the gap and pattern of writing between those first three novels and the latter three novels. So the first three novels are initially drafted in the 1790s, and then Austen returns to them over a 20-year period on and off, and so drafts them again for or revises them for publication in 1810, so from 1809 to 1812. So there's a period where those novels are written in a kind of almost sedimentary way, and critics have pointed out what they call the Stevenson novels, the first three novels written while she was in the family home of her father, Steventon Parsonage. And then the Chawton novels, of course, all written in one full draft, and obviously localised revisions are made, but they're written pretty quickly, so they're written within the space of a year, 18 months. And then they're published upon completion, and they're written in Chawton, so they're called the Chawton novels, which alludes to the Chawton cottage on the estates of her brother. So I think there's a complex layered history in the first novels that can be compared with the kind of alacrity and economy of the later novels. And Emma is the novel that's been singled out by critics for its kind of unified force and focus. And I think you're absolutely right, sort of thinking about a second point, is that in, say, Sense and Sensibility, there are references to English and Englishness, which just tend to be kind of almost adjectival placeholders. They're just, talking about characters and being quite denotative. Whereas in Emma, there is a very clearly charged set of cues when the word England or the related terms Englishness are used. So John Knightley and his brother George Knightley, they greet each other in the true English style. Emma and George Knightley discuss Frank Churchill, who is this sort of liminal character who's been, sort of on the fringes of the novel and then drifts in, causes all sorts of ruffles and mistreats his fiancée. They discuss whether he's amiable in the English sense or aimable in the French sense, and Knightley says he's obviously aimable, he's kind of charming and witty, but he's not truly sort of morally likeable. And so I think you're right to pick up that there is, I think, in these later novels, and we see in Persuasion, and we see, I think, far more ironically treated in Sanditon, this idea about Englishness, and especially Regency culture, which maybe is drifting into Emma, but certainly crystallises in Persuasion and Sanditon. I think the question about Scott's influences is kind of a bit of a chicken and egg question in a way, because we could argue, and Peter did this way back in the essay on the hidden origins of Waverley, when he talks about the way in which Scott himself is using trends and currents that were emerging through women's writing. So in my book, that Peter mentioned, that I published 10 years ago, the chapter on Emma actually looks at Emma as an English national tale, but it reads it against continental national tales by Madame de Staël and the Irish national tales, particularly Sidney Owenson, and less so of Maria Edgeworth. But the point there is, and Andrew Monicandam has looked at this more recently, the relationships between Scott and other female writers exploring national identity, so Christian Johnson, Mary Brunton, Susan Ferrier, so both before, during and after Scott. And there's a kind of triangulation there. So I think in a sense, yes, Scott is an influence, Austen registers that influence, but Austen also makes similar comments. Those comments are quoted about Austen saying Scott has no business to write fiction. She also makes about other popular women writers. So she sort of critiques Sydney Olmsted, she critiques Madame de Staël, she critiques popular evangelical writers, and Mary Brunton, as I brought up. So I think writers that she feels are representative of kind of the threat almost to the kind of fiction that she wants to write, she sort of singles out. But I do think there's a dialogic relationship between Austen and Scott. I've tried to frame it in my talk in terms of their relationship with history, and Jane Millgate has talked about how persuasion is very much inflected by the historical consciousness that Scott displays. And I think similarly, we can see Emma sitting in a kind of triangulation between Scott, her own views, but also those of other women writers who engage with issues of national identity before Scott.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
You don't think Sir Walter Elliot is Walter Scott, do you, in a way? I mean, it's a Scottish name, Elliot. She was a cunning person that Jane Austen was.
I mean, she does pun a lot, doesn't she? I mean, no more so than Emma. Emma's full of those puns, and I can imagine that there would be a sense in which why not have a jibe at Scott?
Really barren, let's see.
Yeah, exactly.
No, any other? I think there's a slight time pressure on there, isn't there? We've got time for 1, 2, 3 more questions.
It's really just almost a follow-up observation on that. How far did she rework Northanger Abbey? In the sense that, I'm thinking of that moment where she's confronted and he says to her, "This is England, think where you are." Because it strikes me that it does, I was interested to see you thinking about the comparison with the description of MacGyver's painting. Because at the end of that, obviously, it finishes, "Men must, however, read," and it's this idea of, it's kind of you're brought right back into it, and it's almost, I was wondering if you could, are you implying a sort of a reading where the kind of Gothic imagination that you have, that Catherine has in Northanger Abbey, she's imagining all these terrible events happening, is the same thing as the kind of, what we're talking about, dreamlike, sort of Jacobite sort of foray of Waverley himself.
So kind of counter histories, counter historical perspectives.
Except that you're playing off masculine and feminine experiences, so you've got a woman imagining this terrible masculine act where the woman is victim, and in Waverley you've got a guy who apparently seems to take part in all these things, albeit that he's manipulated by a woman, as pointed out, to do that. It seems it's an I'm just kind of saying it's a really interesting parallel, I guess.
I think it's. I think to try and split it in the middle and say it's kind of a binary relationship would be, I think, missing the nuance and the mobility of the dynamic that exists in those two perspectives. I think so. Going back to the point about, I think the first thing you said was about the layered history of Northanger Abbey. So she drafts it in the late 1790s, and then there's another element of drafting in the early 1800s when the family moved to Bath, where she describes it firsthand the scenes based on her own experiences in Bath, and then she sells the manuscript to Crosby and Company for publication under the title Susan. So the heroine at that point we presume is called Susan, not Catherine. And then nothing happens, the book isn't published, the novel isn't published, and shortly thereafter Crosby and Co. effectively go into bankruptcy. And it's not until 10 years later, interesting enough on the back of the success of Pride and Prejudice and Emma, that she's able to buy back the copyright of the manuscript and then start reworking it a third time as Northanger Abbey. But Northanger Abbey is a title that we think either her sister Cassandra or her brother Henry gave it. So there's all sorts of kind of interesting histories and alternative histories about the novel. What have they been published in 1803? What would it be? So I think that there's a kind of a layering again going on, where things are being added, things are being taken away. Because when it's originally written, it's the high point of Anne Radcliffe's Gothic. All those Gothic scenes would be particularly topical and relevant. They would be speaking to this moment where, in the 1790s to the 1800s, women's fiction is driving the publication of the novel. Peter's work has made that very clear. And so I think that feminine perspective about the ways in which male tyranny can constrain women's realm of opportunity and action, is caught up in the very kind of politicised decade in the wake of the French Revolution, the period of Mary Wollstonecraft's writing, and the Gothic and its popularity, which repeatedly deploys these themes. You move forward to the novel being published in 1818. It's this kind of strange fragment that's historically suspended. On the one hand, yes, as I mentioned at the start of my talk, we have Frankenstein coming. There's this brief resurgence of the Gothic, but it's a very different kind of Gothic, I think, from Anne Radcliffe's Gothic. So then there's this kind of interesting temporality in history of the relationship when you put Northanger Abbey in that context. So in a sense, I've been speaking about the novel ahistorically by comparing it to Scott, but it's kind of written 20 years nearly before Scott, so there's something there. In terms of when Henry makes his kind of admonishment to Catherine, you think, right, okay, this is the moral moment, the corrective tradition, and the kind of Francis Burney sort of tradition. The moment that Catherine realises she has to grow up, dismantle those Gothic imaginings and face the real world, and then she kind of enters society. And that's what the novel is reaching towards. But what I thought was interesting is that doesn't come very near the end. It comes, near enough the end that you think, okay, this is the way it goes. But then what you have is the ejection of Catherine by General Tilney, very gracelessly sending her back home, and she begins to reflect on his treatment, not only of herself, but also the Tilneys, and then it comes to that perspective, which I think modulates and modifies the corrective view, the didactic view, which is perhaps her Gothic imaginings weren't quite so wrong after all. Maybe she read it a bit melodramatically, but actually, morally speaking, she was right about the kind of tyrannical, volatile nature of the general. And the novel ends, doesn't it, with kind of saying, whether the moral of this story is that children should disobey their parents, and that's how they will be rewarded. I leave it to the reader to decide. So there's a kind of, a little clause there. And I think with the scene in, and a whole section actually of the story which I had to cut out, which was about Gothic readings of Austen and Scott. And I was thinking that scene, which sort of again suspends the romantic view of Edward's sort of fantasy adventure, where I think in a way the get-up clause is, it's not deliberatively that he sort of gets involved in the insurrection. He kind of is a victim of circumstance and his innocence. So there's a way he can be restored in a way that MacIver can't. But I was thinking about the Gothic elements that we find in Bride of Lammermoor and Red Gauntlet, where in some senses Scott seems to prioritise, in Bride of Lammermoor for instance, the love story between Edgar and Lucy over the historical chronicle. Edgar goes off to fight, but in the background, at the centre of it is, yes, the broader context of the transition of power, from the Stuarts to the Hanoverians, and that uncertainty when they're sitting, for the session to decide Scotland's future. But at the same time, there is the kind of private history, at the beginning with Patterson and Tinto talking about the painting and the private history it discloses, I think is an interesting one, and it kind of connects it much more closely to the private narratives of Persuasion, for instance, and say Sense and Sensibility. And similarly, Red Gauntlet, yes, we have this kind of counterfactual revolution that never takes place. It only takes place at the level of narration. They talk about it, they plan it, it never happens. And Darcy wants to sort of get wrapped into it. Well, he gets roped into it unwillingly, but he ends up sort of being disguised as a woman and bound and gagged. So he's emasculated through it, and he's rescued sort of in the arm. He falls into the arms, doesn't he, of Alan at one point, which kind of repositions it very, very satirically into the convention of the romantic story. So the historical Red Gauntlet there is also being sublimated into a kind of quasi-romantic, ahistorical narrative. And I think that there's work that can be done there that picks up on that scene that we see at the end of the painting in Waverley, right at the beginning, that a decade later Red Gauntlet, and through things like Bride of Lammermoor, that sort of ferments there. So I don't know if that's answered your question or addressed it.
That's great, thank you very much. We've got time for one or two quick interchanges at this point. Because we're slightly overrunning now. Anybody got a quick question for a quick answer? Okay, nobody's risen to the challenge. So
Bested you all.
I gave you my quick question already, I'm afraid, and it remains for David Withington on behalf of the club to offer our vote of thanks.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to thank Professor Mandal for that very rich and very detailed account. I think for those of us who are interested in Scott, it's very valuable to have fresh light, fresh perspective on his work, and you've certainly given us that. And I was particularly interested in this idea, of course, of fiction helping us to move out of our own conceptual world, and then these authors offering different alternative worlds for us to enter. And also this idea of transcending the past on behalf of the future. I thought very interesting indeed. And also this idea that, that it may turn reality about a bit and lead to a different future. So thank you very much, Professor Mandal. Please join me in thanking you.